Hello and welcome to Module 2, Humanizing the Online Classroom. My name is Tiffani Templeton and welcome to our discussion of this academic article. So before we begin, it's important to first introduce the authors of today's article. So the article is titled Humanizing the Changing Face of Distance Learning as Reflected Through Emerging Potentials for Equity, Social Justice, and Social Change. And this is brought to you by the authors Caroline M. Crawford of the University of Houston, Texas, as well as Ruth Gannon Cook. And a way I would like to humanize these lovely ladies is through presenting a picture of them. And that's one simple way that you can help humanize various components of the online learning environment for your students. Now, the 21st century is often referred to as the information age, and distance learning is known by many names, some of which include e-learning, online learning, as well as hybridized education, so half online, half in the physical classroom. But it's really important that behind every screen, we remember that there is a student there, a real live breathing student. And we need to make sure that we are giving our best to them through a professional responsibility and through a human responsibility to nurture our students and help them flourish. And I decided to include this robot imagery in the slide because I think it's really important that we help introduce ourselves to our students and help them bridge those online communications with each other so they do not feel like they are engaging in an artificial environment. They might as well be talking to a robot if they're in online school, right? No, we're trying to connect them with each other so that they can see that there's real human contact there. And I have experienced some success in this as a high school teacher during the pandemic. And I've also experienced not such successful outcomes with some of my classes, and I'll get into that a little bit later in today's presentation. Also, the online information age and online education is framed through social equity, social justice, and social change, as we'll see through these articles. And it's also about humanizing the online learning experience through our intentions and our pedagogy. Also utilizing various course management systems and supporting both traditional and non-traditional learners in the online learning environment. Now, we're going to be looking for the purpose of this instruction through pedagogy, which is essentially developing learning environments and programs for students that are children, okay? So when we are looking at pedagogy, we're talking about teaching children who have less responsibilities than typical adults. But again, it's important that you guys know your school community because in my experience, in my district, I've worked at schools on both the east side and the west side, and they're very different. There are divisions with socioeconomic class, and parents having various professions and access to different resources for their kids. So when I was on the east side, it was a more affluent professional environment. Parents had professional degrees and careers, and the west side was more working class. Students had less access socioeconomically to things, which meant that my students had to work. They had to go out of the home and work to help support for their family. They also had to provide childcare to their younger siblings when in the house, and they had home responsibilities and chores on top of schoolwork. So I quickly learned, coming from the east side to the west side, that these were a different type of student who had different responsibilities. So I think for me, I had to kind of apply a halfway between the adult learners and the children learner pedagogy. So teachers typically with pedagogy disseminate information to pupils who are dependent on them for knowledge and information. And students will take this with their limited life experience and they'll build connections between the knowledge that they're learning and the experiences that they have made so far. And the purpose essentially is a requirement. So students are engaging in education because they are required to do so rather than choosing to do this for personal enrichment as one would do with post-secondary school. And this will result in learning where students essentially are completing this because it's part of an educational requirement for graduation of high school to complete their early education. Types of online learners, we're going to be focusing more or less on the traditional learner versus the non-traditional. Traditional learners are young, they are full-time students, so their job essentially should be their full-time in high school or middle school. And it is typically done within the classroom, the confines of the classroom, but we will see that there is the online component to this as well. And, most of them are doing this because it is a requirement of their education. And when we're looking at non-traditional learners, that means they are place-bound, perhaps they're part-time, and usually they are mature or younger because they are place-bound. And they typically are, doing enrichment, college types of education. Perhaps they're doing continuing education for professional careers, etc. So when we are looking at an online learning environment, we're looking at a course management system, but in secondary education, we also know these as learning management systems. Many of these are for-profit, but there are some non-for-profit or open source ones. I am not aware of any of those aside from the ones I read in the article, but usually your district will provide you one and say, this is what our district uses, have at it, and then you must engage in the fun training of that so that you can utilize that. Now, online course structures should parallel your learning management system so that students have a consistency and it really makes sense for them when they're engaging in an activity online. Perhaps you would use that learning management system where students would then post in a discussion thread and you would use that to disseminate information and provide context for them. And there also needs to be thoughtful consideration from the teacher to the students of instruction, providing motivation and teaching them about internal and intrinsic motivation and other factors. Also upholding various societal factors, making sure that students are still collaborating as they would in a physical classroom. And there's also a realization that we need to see how learners approach learning differently. Now, we are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs in our teacher education, and we'll review that. But essentially, there is a different area of need known as Crawford's distance delivery hierarchy of needs, which is closely linked to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, what we know from Maslow is that people have to have their basic needs met and satisfied before they are able to move on to up the ranks to self-actualization and, pursue different fruits of life. So essentially, we have our physiological needs. We need to make sure that we have shelter, food, clothing before we can start looking at safety and security. Then after we have met those needs, we can start looking at for building relationships and social needs. And then we can start developing self-esteem. And then therefore we can move on to the various branches of self-actualization and fulfillment in life. But we need to learn from our inner nature and understand that for students, limits and controls are good. So when we are providing safe environments for students, helping them establish healthy boundaries between instruction, work, social engagement, et cetera, just learning about how to make boundaries and making good choices. They also must grapple with the importance of life and death. So that's what we're seeing with Maslow. When we have all of our needs met, we can start entertaining more loftier ideals. Now with Crawford, we have Crawford's distance delivery hierarchy of needs. And at the base of this, in order to be a successful online student, you need to have your technological needs met. You also must have some sort of digital literacy or fluency, and you need to understand how to self-regulate and motivate yourself. There are also social interactive needs. So through those course management or learning management systems, students need to collaborate so that they are moving through the information, bouncing their ideas off other people and making meaning of that for themselves. And also they will move up to fulfillment through self-actualization after they have met the needs through technology. Now, it needs to be said that a student must have their personal needs met through Maslow's hierarchy before they can really satisfy the needs of Crawford's distance learning. So a few takeaways from Crawford's means that they must have digital literacy and fluency. So that could mean a lot of different things depending on your student base. So it's important that teachers spend a lot of time and energy front loading information and also checking out to see like what are your students, where are they? Where do they lie on the spectrum of technology? What experience do they have? Because you can't just say, we're going to start off here. You have to pretty much put your feelers out and see where all of your students lie. Now, societal communications, we're going to be looking a little bit at the theories of Vygotsky and his theories in the classroom. So students must interact and engage in a society of learners to help gain and make meaning of the information that's presented to them. And Vygotsky asserts that students have social interactions. Well, they make meaning through social interactions while they're promoting their cognitive development. And when students are grappling with these loftier ideas, that's where they reach that zone of proximal development. So presenting ideas, material to students, helping them make meaning of that through bridging communication with their peers, having discussions, working on collaborative group projects, grappling with that information, that is that sweet spot, that zone of proximal development where students begin making meaning for themselves. So social interaction is key to this process. Furthermore, humanizing the online learning environment comes from the tenets that the authors suggest are present in online learning in the 21st century online learning environment. So rooted in the foundations of social equity, which essentially is fair and equitable distribution of public services, so public school education. Essentially, we offer equity for protected classes of students which do not discriminate against age, race, religion, or disability. It is also rooted in the idea of social justice, which is based on the idea of a fair society where benefits are shared among the people of that society. So essentially, social justice is concerned with many different facets that plague society or that are concerns within society. So issues of poverty, capitalism, socialism, discrimination, government regulation of the economy, free enterprise, environmentalism, taxation, charity, and diversity are among many issues that are tackled within social justice, as well as social change. And this is change in the nature of societal institutions, acts of changing society in normative ways regarding people, structures, and shared values. And this can occur over many timeframes. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's radical, and it can occur on larger or smaller subsets of areas of society. And the image here just kind of talks about teachers having awareness, empathy, and presence in the online learning environment. I almost feel like you need to be more assertive as a teacher to find out and dig for information on your students, because they can just go dark online and you're like, what's going on with this kid? How can I help support them better? Because you truly do not know what is going on the other side of that screen. So you really do need to make the effort to reach out and be present and available for your students with empathy, ready to support them. All right, types of online students and how they inform instruction. Now, as I mentioned, on the East and West side, I had encountered a spectrum of students where they had their needs fully met and they were safe and happy at home. They had a strong they had their needs met, they had a strong home base where they could do their homework and they had free time and leisure time. And then I had students who were struggling because they had to work to help support their families. They needed to provide childcare for their younger siblings. They had chores and extra responsibilities around home, and school was, falling by the wayside for their responsibilities and priorities. So depending on your student base, you need to get to know your community. So don't forget, there are a variety of learners. For example, students who are English language learners, perhaps they have IEPs or 504s for various disabilities or learning disabilities. You also have your accelerated students. And I think sometimes the accelerated students can kind of get forgotten about because we need to provide rigor for them so that they don't get bored. And we have our at-risk students, maybe some that might have different factors at home that are putting them at risk. And then we have our average students. And I think those are students too that kind of can fall by the wayside because we're thinking, okay, good, they're doing their thing. But I think it's still really essential we check in with all of our students. Teachers' values to incorporate are empathy, flexibility, and grace. Grace seemed to be the buzzword during distance learning when we all went in for the pandemic. And it's taken me a while to understand what exactly grace means. But essentially it means flexibility, providing equitable support, and a willingness to listen and support your students. So I think that's something that teachers, are starting to learn how to incorporate better. A larger question from this module: do student outcomes truly improve for all students through digital tools? I don't know if this is necessarily a yes or no question that we can answer. But I think there are a few things that we can touch upon. So expectations are rooted in social justice and equity. So this means that not all students have equitable access, unfortunately. Districts might make efforts to provide equitable access, but unfortunately, when students are home, they might not always have their needs met or are not able to have their needs met. Whereas some students, their parents are quite willing and able to help support them. So how can we intervene without overstepping? I think that's a question that we need to work with other professionals and school community members on, and our students, of course, and their families. Proper planning and execution. So it doesn't just run on its own. You have to put a lot of time, thought, and energy into planning an online learning environment. And students must also balance their responsibilities. And then it's also dependent upon internal motivation, access, and resources for our students and for our teachers. Larger question number 2, is it possible to humanize our digital engagements in the classroom? I believe, yes, it is possible to humanize. It's not going to be a perfect supplement for face-to-face interaction. Sometimes it can come close depending on the buy-in from your students and how much you have done to set up your online learning environment and how much willingness each party is willing to put in. So it really depends. High school students prefer structure and order over the unknown. And I know this because I run my classroom highly structured, because essentially it means low stress. Once there is a formula for how class is going to be run, students can really depend upon that. And then you have time to improvise in between once you have the structure in place. Online learning can promote opportunities for authentic engagement. So community building is key, making sure that you take the time to build community up front, but then you also have to maintain that through activities and different lessons throughout the distance learning process. Create a class culture with scaffolds. So one thing that I did in my online learning environment, I created icebreakers when I put students in groups, because I joined a school, didn't know the kids. Then I realized after I did a survey, they didn't know each other. So I assigned groups, and then I created games for them to do before they got into the actual lesson. So once they had their guard down, they were relaxed, they were able to participate. And then, you know what, when we returned to the online or to the physical environment, a lot of those kids stayed friends because they met in those groups and they played games with each other. And there was a variety of ways how they talked too. So promote and create student groups, encourage and assign activities for engagement. So I did a lot of group work so that students could assess their cognitive load, and they could communicate and they could learn with each other. And then promote online collaboration, offer scaffolds to support community building, and also encourage camera and voice for communication in a high school environment. This was not a requirement for my district at all, and I understood why, but I think that it really did create a hurdle that made things very difficult to create that humanistic quality, because when you can look at somebody and you can talk with somebody, you can make better connections. Some kids completely, the entire time, they just typed with their group mates and they still made friends with each other. And I thought that was remarkable. So, you know, we are all still learning through this process as well. So a few closing thoughts. Remember that there is a student behind every screen online, and don't forget about them as a person. Harmonize the online learning with student-centered practices and use equity and empathy as practices and values to guide you in your instruction. And be thoughtful about your pedagogy. Support learners that are both traditional and non-traditional. Well, thank you very much for joining me on this discussion for Module 2. My name is Tiffani Templeton, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module. Thank you.